Hello and welcome to Frank Philosophy, where we speak frankly about philosophy. I'm your host, Frank. I have a BA, an MPhil, and a PhD in philosophy, and I teach philosophy at a university far, far away. And today we're going to be looking at an article written by a fellow that you might know for non-philosophical reasons by the name of Leo Tolstoy. He's written such classics as War and Peace, which you may have heard of, Anna Karenina, which you may have heard of, and many other things. I think in philosophy classes where his name is most often likely to show up would be in an aesthetics course, because he has a theory of art that it's been influential in aesthetics. So that's where you're most likely to come across him in the context or outside of the context of literature and in the context of academic philosophy. But today we're looking at a short piece that he wrote as a preface to a psychology book it was published in 1890. So this is old, but not that old. Post-industrial world, right? The 1890s were. And he wrote this little ditty called "Why Do Men Stupefy Themselves?" And that's the question, that's the topic, where stupefy refers to the act of imbibing, consuming, or otherwise ingesting substances that alter one's mental state, right? So getting drunk, or he has a lot to say about smoking cigarettes, tobacco. So this is going to basically be Leo Tolstoy's argument for sobriety, really. And it's interesting because he doesn't really come at it from the perspective of, say, addiction, right? Where the question is, well, why do people who have severe problems managing alcohol and other substances, what makes their situation so dire? It's more of a general complaint that the whole idea of habitually stupefying oneself, it runs through, all the practices. It runs through everybody who does it, really. And so it's a pretty strong conclusion, right? So you might want to put down your beer for this one. I kind of like this piece. I think it's a lot of fun. I think it makes some pretty good arguments. Again, it's not like academic philosophy, but it's, I think, a really good example of good writing from an excellent writer that isn't a work of literature, right? It's a work of prose. This is nonfiction. This is just what Tolstoy thinks, and as a very intelligent guy who's studied and observed human behavior and written about it in fictional settings for his whole career, and made a lot of made a name for himself doing it, and highly regarded for it, writing about a topic that is something that we're all dealing with today. And I will say, just as a preface to this, even though the substances he talks about might be a little different from those today, at least as I read through this, I think of other substances that are, widely used by people nowadays that sort of have the same effect and might be subject to the same criticisms, right? So, there seems to be a lot more marijuana smoking nowadays than, back in the 1890s or whatever. And I might even argue that certain non-substance stupefying practices, like, scrolling on TikTok, for example, right? Where that sort of has a similar mood-altering effect on those who do it with any regularity. So I'm thinking of, when I read through this, even though it's dated in some of its more specific references, it touches on or at least it tries to touch on something that's universally human, right? A universal part of the human experience, and the human experience with mind-altering substances, which goes back pretty far, right? So again, maybe put down your beer for this one. Now, full disclosure, I don't necessarily condone what the arguments are given here, and I'll have some things to say as we go through the piece. Again, he makes a lot of references, and he does. He sets up a system for how he thinks human consciousness works, and he gives a psychological theory, basically, of why he thinks people do smoke or drink or whatever it is. Is it necessarily correct? No, right? We don't know if it's really correct. I mean, he was writing this way before we had clinical psychology sort of at the dawn of the emergence of clinical psychology, but certainly not as scientific or robust as a format as we have nowadays. But nevertheless, he was a really smart guy, and I think most people would agree with that. And he clearly thought very deeply about this. And he's somebody who did at one point in his life drink and smoke, but he stopped. And this is sort of his rationale for why. He doesn't give any indication that he was a problem user, that he was, something of an alcoholic or a chain smoker or anything like that. He gives the indication in his writings that his use was moderate, but he still thinks that that's not worth doing at all either. So it's a bit unclear to what extent he saw his own behavior as problematic, or to what extent it actually was, but at the end of the day, he's convinced that, nope, not doing it anymore. And again, I don't necessarily agree with that, but it's still an interesting piece of persuasion and argument, and I would argue philosophy. Another thing, I'll get to that in a little bit. Let's just get reading. So this is Why Do Men Stupefy Themselves by Leo Tolstoy, translated by Alamer Maud. And this is a Creative Commons Attribution Share-alike license. I'll have a link to the Wikisource page. It's not on Gutenberg, but it is on Wikisource, this translation of it. So you can read it yourself, and it has links to, I think there's like 2 or 3 specific name references that you might want to follow up with. But I highly recommend reading it, and we're going to read it together right now. Okay, what is the explanation of the fact that people use things that stupefy them? Vodka, wine, beer, hashish, opium, tobacco, and other things less common. Ether, morphia, fly archaic, etc. I would assume that morphia is like related to morphine. I'm not sure. This is the 1890s. I have no idea what ether or fly agaric is. I don't know what that is. But, I mean, people had all sorts of ways to alter their consciousness now. And the ways that we do nowadays with pharmaceuticals and other things surely didn't exist back in Tolstoy's time, or in before then either. But still the effect is the same. So he lumps all these substances together and says that, well, it's all, the common denominator here is to stupefy oneself. Right? Why did the practice begin? Why is it spread so rapidly, and why is it still spreading among all sorts of people, savage and civilized? How is it that where there is no vodka, wine, or beer, we find opium, hashish, fly agaric, and the like, and that tobacco is used everywhere? Right. So this is sort of a relativity point where the idea is, well, the various substances that we use might vary from culture to culture, but there's always something, right? People are always doing something to, get wasted and get messed up and forget what's going on and alter their consciousness, right? Regardless of how they do it. And the question is, why do we do it? Why do people wish to stupefy themselves? And this is his question. And it's kind of interesting how it's not a very common question. One of the things I really love about this piece is that there's not a whole lot like it, really, in philosophy, in the canon. There's not many or any philosophers, really, I won't say any, that attack this question head on. Probably the closest that I could think of, at least in my experience, and maybe others know more, are the Confessions of St. Augustine, who, he dealt with sex addiction, and he claims that his mother was or had some sort of alcohol problem at some point. St. Augustine, back in the 3rd century, I believe. I could be wrong about that, so don't quote me on the century. But regardless, it's not a very common topic, at least as far as I know. Maybe I'm just looking in the wrong place, but I really like how he just comes right out and says it, right? Why do people wish to stupefy themselves? Why? Ask anyone why he began drinking wine and why he now drinks it, and he'll reply, oh, I like it, and everybody drinks. And he may add, it cheers me up. Some, those who have never once taken the trouble to consider whether they do well or ill to drink wine, may add that wine is good for the health and adds to one's strength. That is to say, they'll make a statement long since proved baseless. Right? So basically, Tolstoy is saying, when people say, they start to give like benign reasons for why they drink, it's all bullshit, right? It's all bullshit. Right? It's not good for the health, right? There is no amount of alcohol that is actually healthy. And Tolstoy's no doctor, but he knew this. Everybody knows this. And there were a couple studies a couple years ago that said, there are a couple famous studies that'll say things like, 1 glass of red wine per day tends to track certain kinds of health benefits or whatever, or heart health or something. But a lot of those studies have been debunked because they track lifestyle instead of alcohol consumption. And so I'm suspicious of many of those studies. But even if it were true, even if there were some health benefits, it's hard to say that the associated costs with regularly forcing your body to process alcohol are outweighed by any benefits of doing so because of the other chemicals in wine, right? Whether it's vitamin C or antioxidants or whatever it may be. So maybe we can debate the science on it, but Tolstoy at any rate thinks that it's just bullshit, right? It doesn't make you stronger. It's not good for your health, right? But people say it, right? As a smoker, or ask a smoker why he began to use tobacco and why he now smokes, and he will also reply, well, to while away the time, and everybody smokes. Similar answers would probably be given to those who use opium, hashish, morphia, or fly agaric. Again, don't know what those things are. Well, I know what hashish is. A little more common today, I guess, right? To while away the time, to cheer oneself up, everybody does it. But it might be excusable to twiddle one's thumbs, to whistle, to hum tunes, to play a fife, or to do something of that sort to while away the time, or to cheer oneself up, or because everybody does it. That is to say, it might be excusable to do something which does not involve wasting nature's wealth, or spending what has cost great labor to produce, or doing what brings evident harm to oneself and others. So what's he saying here? Well, he's saying basically, if the excuse is to just kill time or to cheer yourself up or because everybody does it, there's lots of other stuff that fits that bill as well, right? If you really want to kill time, just go for a walk, right? Or sit and twiddle your thumbs, or start humming, or do literally anything else other than make yourself dumb with some sort of substance, right? That's the point here. Again, I'm not endorsing any of what he's saying here. I just want to be as charitable as possible in reconstructing what he's saying, and if I find it persuasive, then apologies for being biased at any point. But my goal is, again, to give this piece the fairest shake that we could, to give it the fairest hearing that we can. And he'll say plenty of stuff that is a little more suspicious. But again, right now, let's just go with it, right? Let's give him the benefit of the doubt, right? So again, the idea is, well, if your excuse is to, kill time or cheer yourself up, there's lots of other ways you can do it without, getting drunk. But to produce tobacco, wine, hashish, and opium, the labor of millions of men is spent, and millions of acres of the best land, often amid a population that is short of land, are employed to grow potatoes, hemp, poppies, vines, and tobacco. Right? So he's acknowledging basically the economic costs of stupefying substances. And maybe if not exactly the same situation as it was in the 1890s or at any other time in history, there certainly are a lot of resources dedicated to substance production, right? Tobacco farms and vineyards and different sorts of liquor production operations or drug production operations, gangs, right? Illicit drug trades and things like that. Very, very labor and money intensive projects, right? So it's this point about, like, clearly we're committed to the existence of these industries on a massive scale. Moreover, the use of these evidently harmful things produces terrible evils, known and admitted by everyone, and destroys more people than all the wars and contagious diseases added together. This is just one of many sort of eyebrow raisers. Can I raise my eyebrow? Yeah, there it is. Where he just sort of says things that, like me, nowadays, I'd like to see a citation, please. Like, where is that data coming from? Does it really do that? Maybe. I think like 1 in 10 of all people or all drinkers are alcoholic or something like that. It is like shockingly high. And it does a lot of damage. But to like calculate the number of evils produced by, substance usage, not even abuse, but just usage, compared to like all diseases and wars combined. I don't know. I get his point, right? That like clearly it's a huge deal. And if we really cared about addressing the harms, we would do something about it. But we clearly don't seem to be fazed, at least on a universally, human level, about the harms that it causes, right? Or that substance use causes. And people know this. All right, I'll give it to you. So they cannot really use these things to while away the time, to cheer themselves up, or because everybody does it. Right? So again, like, this is just building the disanalogy between the sorts of answers that make sense to give when you want to do something to while away the time, to cheer yourself up, or because everybody does it, compared to using those excuses for stupefying yourself. Those excuses are generally less believable because of how those substances are just so different from all the other ways that we can accomplish these things without the use of substances, right? So there must be some other reason, basically. Everybody who says this, I drink because of these reasons, they're just bullshitting, right? Because, first of all, drinking is very different from anything else you might do to, address these issues, right, of, killing time. Just give a thumbs up. And secondly, because there's other things you could be doing. So it's not that. There must be some other reason. Continually and everywhere, one meets people who love their children and are ready to make all kinds of sacrifices for them, but yet who spend on vodka, wine, and beer, or opium, hashish, or even tobacco, as much as would quite suffice to feed their hungry and poverty-stricken children, or at least as much as would suffice to save them from misery. So he's talking about people who prioritize buying these substances over giving money to their children or spending money on their family's welfare. Not too difficult to imagine people who do this, right? Not too difficult to imagine people who, just say, screw it, I'm gonna go out to the bar tonight, or screw it, I'm gonna, even if it's more money than I'd like to spend right now, and I, of course I could go and buy my kid a new whatever, a new widget. I'm gonna spend the money on a couple drinks at the bar with the boys instead, and that's what I'm gonna do instead. And Tolstoy says that's weird, right? That's really weird. That's weird, right? So there must be even to make that decision, right? Something else needs to be going on other than I'm just trying to kill time, right? Because you could kill time by shopping for your kid, right? For example. So, not really satisfying old Leo here. And he's, especially focused on situations where it's quite drastic, where people are maybe in the lower classes are spending money on stupefying substances instead of their kids, to a point where it's problematic, right? So evidently, if a man who has to choose between the want and sufferings of a family he loves on the one hand and abstinence from stupefying things on the other chooses the former, he must be induced thereto by something more potent than the consideration that everybody does it, or that it is pleasant, right? Evidently it is done not to while away the time, nor merely to cheer himself up. He is actuated by some more powerful cause, right? So there's something else going on when we decide to go out and get drunk instead of do something more benign to while away the time, right? Go home and watch Netflix or something, right? Go for a walk or a run. This cause, as far as I have detected it by reading about this subject and by observing other people, and particularly by observing my own case when I used to drink wine and smoke tobacco, this cause, I think, may be explained as follows. So now he's going to give us the reason. Why do people do it? And he's going to sort of introduce his reason here. And now he gets into his psychological theory. When observing his own life, a man may often notice in himself two different beings. The one is blind and physical. The other sees and is spiritual. So again, this is a very common sort of Western philosophy way of putting things, where there's the divine component in us and the animal component in us. And I should say that Tolstoy was very committed to Christianity, very much a Christian. So it's no surprise that he's going this route. But you don't really need to accept the tenets of Christianity to accept this. You don't even need to believe in a non-physical soul or an immortal soul or any metaphysics to accept this distinction right here, right? Where the idea is just that, well, usually there's different forces fighting within us for control over what we actually do. The one is sort of focused on physical pleasures, and the other is more focused on higher order pleasures or moral cultivation or things like that, right? The blind animal being eats, drinks, rests, sleeps, propagates, and moves like a wound-up machine. The seeing spiritual being that is bound up with the animal does nothing of itself, but only appraises the activity of the animal being, coinciding with it when approving of its activity and diverging from it when disapproving. So these two things within us are quite different from one another. And this is, again, very much in the within the tradition of Western philosophy, specifically a sort of dualism, going back to even Descartes, which we'll do a video on. We'll do a couple on Descartes eventually. But the idea is just that there's part of us that doesn't seem to directly influence what we do. It more of just sort of appraises or judges what we do. So this is like the rational soul that is supposed to be what issues the more reliable and divine guidance for what we should be doing, rather than just following around your nose or your stomach. Right? So there's this dualism. There's a higher part of us that is moral and good and spiritual, and then there's the animal part of us. Right? So I think that's easy to accept as like just a general thesis about the way things could be. I don't necessarily think you need to accept the metaphysics of Cartesian dualism to say, yeah, that's, to buy into this. So I'm just going to go with it. I think, yeah, sure, okay. And he gives this analogy, right? This observing being may be compared to the needle of a compass, pointing with one end to the north and with the other end to the south, but screened along its whole length by something not noticeable so long as it and the needle both point the same way, but which becomes obvious as soon as they point different ways. So, do I have to explain how a compass works? A compass is like a needle, it points north, right? And the needle moves along a stationary setting. And the idea, or Tolstoy's idea, is that our conscious kind of works like that, where we don't really notice when everything's going well, but as soon as something goes off, then we notice that the needle is still pointing north, but the indicator on the static compass body itself is it's off, so we're not going north anymore, even though the needle still points north. Right? And he says that, the relationship between our activities and our spiritual conscience is like that. In the same manner, the seeing spiritual being, whose manifestation we commonly call conscience, always points with one end towards the right and with one end towards wrong. And we do not notice it when we follow along, or when we follow the course it shows, the course from wrong to right. But one need only do something contrary to the indication of conscience to become aware of the spiritual being, which then shows how the animal activity has diverged from the direction indicated by conscience. So, a couple things going on here. On the one hand, two theses to really get a grip of front and center here. The one is this moral intuition idea that basically everybody knows right and wrong in an intuitive sense. Like, we all have a moral compass, and it all roughly points in the same direction. That's one thesis. Is it true? Not sure. Right? Not sure. It was definitely a view that people had in many corners of the Western philosophical tradition. This idea that there are intuitive moral truths that we all just sort of know, regardless of any differences between us, and a lot of that has to do with morality being something given by God, for example. So, that's one thesis, and we can, we don't have to, I think, adjudicate that to at least agree that, there's at least widespread agreement on certain moral judgments, right? Murder is bad. I think that's like pretty safe, right? Abusing those who can't defend themselves is bad, right? Stuff like that. And the idea, which is the second point, is that this really only becomes present to us when we do something wrong, right? Our conscience only ever kicks on when we do something that needs to be corrected, right? I do something harmful to somebody else and I say, oh, I shouldn't have said that. Oh, I shouldn't have done that. Oh, I overreacted. Oh, I shouldn't have whatever. My action departs from what I know to be right. And then I notice, my conscience is now I'm now off kilter and out of sync with my conscience, and I have to correct it and return. So that's like the model that he's going with here. And as a navigator, conscious that he is on the wrong track, cannot continue to work the oars, engines, or sails till he has adjusted his course to the indications of the compass, or has obliterated his consciousness of this divergence. Each man who has felt the duality of his animal activity and his conscience can continue his activity only by adjusting that activity to the demands of conscience, or by hiding from himself the indications conscience gives him of the wrongness of his animal life. Mouthful. Instead of me explaining it, I'll just let him explain it, because he goes on and actually just rephrases things a little more clearly in the next paragraph, right? All human life, we may say, consists solely of these two activities: bringing one's activity into harmony with conscience, or hiding from oneself the indications of conscience in order to be able to continue to live as before, right? So if we accept this model that quite often we find ourselves doing things that we know aren't in line with our conscience, we have two choices of how to respond. We could, on the one hand, correct our actions, right, and act in a way that returns to being in accordance with our conscience. We could do that. Or we could somehow try to get rid of that voice in our head that's telling us that we're doing something wrong, in order to continue to act as we've realized is not in accordance with our conscience, right? So that's really what you have to do, right? You either keep going and ignore it, or you correct, right? Some do the first, others the second. To attain the first, there is but one means: moral enlightenment, right? To increase of light in oneself and attention to what it shows. Right, so that's the hard way, right? That's one way to do it. You do something wrong, you correct it, and you file that away, and you say, okay, now I'm a little more morally enlightened about what I should be doing, and I'm going to behave accordingly in the future, right? And that's the process of moral development and moral enlightenment. So that's one way you could do it. The first option. To attain the second, to hide from oneself the indicators of conscience, there are two means, one external and the other internal. The external means consists in occupations that divert one's attention from the indications given by conscience, and the internal method consists in darkening conscience itself. Okay, so we have two different branches here, right? We have this first branch, right? And then this second branch has two other branches, right? You can either change our actions or change our relationship with our conscience and preserve our actions. And we can do that in one of two ways: an internal or an external way. And it goes on to explain that with an analogy. A man has two ways of avoiding seeing an object that is before him: either by diverting his sight to other, more striking objects, or by obstructing the sight of his own eyes, or by obstructing the sight from his own eyes, just so a man can hide from himself the indications of consciousness in two ways, or the indications of conscience in two ways. I'm going to get those mixed up. Conscience and consciousness. He talks about both. English. Ugh. Either by the external method of diverting his attention to various occupations, cares, amusements, or games, or by the internal method of obstructing the organ of attention itself. Right, so we have two choices when we don't want to change our behavior, right? We either try to distract ourselves by focusing on something else and say, look over here, I didn't I could sit and think about that bad thing that I did and try to correct the situation, or I could just watch Netflix and get distracted, right? Could focus on something else. Or I could just try and dull that source of guilt directly, internally, by using substances, right? That's the idea. That's where we're going. He doesn't say that yet, but it'll build up to that. For people of dull, limited moral feeling, the external diversions are often quite sufficient to enable them not to perceive the indications conscience gives of the wrongness of their lives. Ooh, brutal. Dummy shaming. So things like, for most people who don't really think too much about their actions, Netflix will do the trick, right? You do something wrong, you do something bad you don't feel so good about, and you say, I'll just move on to something else, right? You get over it pretty quickly. But for morally sensitive people, those means are often insufficient. So there's a different kind of person who really does get personally affected by their own shortcomings, right? They feel like they should be doing something, and they're not living up to their expectations or their standards, wherever they come from, whether they're internal, whether they're imposed from their upbringing or whatever it may be. And usually it's not enough to just distract oneself. They'll, dwell in their mistakes or shortcomings, right? And the external means do not quite divert attention from the consciousness of discord between one's life and the demands of conscience. The consciousness hampers one's life. And in order to be able to go on living as before, people have recourse to the reliable internal method, which is that of darkening conscience itself by poisoning the brain with stupefying substances. Okay, so that's the answer, right? That's where he's going. Right. One is not living as conscience demands, yet lacks the strength to reshape one's life in accord with its demands. That's why. The diversions which might distract attention from the consciousness of this discord are insufficient or have become stale, and so, in order to be able to live on, disregarding the indications conscience gives of the wrongness of their life, people, by poisoning it temporarily, stop the activity of the organ, namely the brain, through which conscience manifests itself. As a man, by covering his eyes, hides from himself what he does not wish to see. So that's the idea, right? So drinking or doing any sort of mind-altering substance is a way of sort of coping with our inability to live up to the standards of our own conscience, right? The fact that we are guilty and dissatisfied and upset with ourselves, and we have no other option than to drink to sort of dull that guilt, because otherwise it would just be with us all the time because we can't live up to the demands of conscience. Also, my dog is being annoying, so I'm going to let her outside. One sec. Sorry about that. She wants to come in here, and then as soon as I get going, she wants to leave. I guess she's not a fan of Tolstoy. Anyway. Yeah, okay. So that's section 1, right? So that's the idea. We go from why do people stupefy themselves, and then we get to Tolstoy's thesis, right? He says, well, they do it because they're not living up to the demands of conscience, of their conscience, and they need a way to not feel that constant pain of being insufficient with respect to their conscience, right? Of not living up to their own moral standards, right? And that's why they get drunk. That's the theory. If that sounds utterly unscientific and totally crazy, tell me why in the comments. But, I mean, at least at first glance, I think it explains some of what's going on, right? I'm sure that that's true for some people. I'm sure that's why some people drink or use substances. He's going to go on to give more reasons for why actually this is why everybody does it, even in cases where it might seem like they're not doing it for that reason. So he's going to defend this view as we move forward. Okay. The cause of the worldwide consumption of hashish, opium, wine, and tobacco lies not in the taste, nor in any pleasure, recreation, or mirth they afford, but simply in man's need to hide from himself the demands of conscience. So, anybody who says, I drink for the taste, or I smoke because I just like the flavor, right? Tolstoy is going to say, no, you don't. You're full of it. That's just bullshit, right? You don't. Nobody does it for that reason. Pretty bold position to take up. It's I don't know. That might be a strike against his theory that it's, if everybody who says that is lying, that's not a great. Or if your theory requires that everybody who gives a pretty common answer to a question is lying, you better have a really good theory for why that is to back it up. Okay, I was going along the street one day and passing some cabmen who were talking. I heard one of them say, "Of course, when a man's sober, he'd be ashamed to do it." Right, and this is sort of a... Now, did this actually happen? Who knows? Who cares, really? But this is sort of the attitude that Tolstoy wishes to expose, right? That people do things when they're sober, or they do things when they're under the influence that they wouldn't normally do when they were sober. And that's the idea. And I think that's a pretty common one. When a man is sober, he's ashamed of what seems all right when he's drunk. In these words, we have the essential underlying cause prompting men to resort to stupefiers. People resort to them either to escape feeling ashamed after having done something contrary to their conscience, or to bring themselves beforehand into a state in which they can commit actions contrary to conscience, but to which their animal nature prompts them. Right, so that's why people drink. Either they did something bad and they don't want to keep feeling guilt about it, so they drink to get rid of the guilt, or they're about to enter into a situation where they think that some guilt might result, and they drink to get rid of their inhibitions. Right? And this is a pretty common usage as well. Right? So a man, when sober, is ashamed to go after a prostitute, ashamed to steal, ashamed to kill. A drunken man is ashamed of none of these things, and therefore if a man wishes to do something his conscience condemns, he stupefies himself. Right? So these are pretty radical, I would say, actions that you're sort of preparing to do, and committed to doing them, even if you know you're wrong. So you get drunk, so you don't have to feel as bad about it. But as Tolstoy goes on to say, there are less extreme cases where we seem to be doing the same sort of thing. But he's talking about the most obvious cases that he knows of first. Right? I remember being struck by the evidence of a cook who was tried for murdering a relation of mine, an old lady in whose service he lived. He related that when he had sent away his paramour, the servant girl, and the time had come to act, he wished to go into the bedroom with a knife, but felt that while sober he could not commit the deed he had planned. It goes back again to what the cabbie said, right? When a man is sober, he's ashamed. Right? He turned back, drank 2 tumblers of vodka he had prepared beforehand, and only then felt himself ready and committed the crime. 9/10 of the crimes are committed that way. Drink to keep up your courage. Now again, 9/10 of the crimes, I don't know where that's coming from. Are those, is that statistics? Is Leo just making stuff up? I don't know. He probably read something. He probably saw it somewhere. He might not be completely making it up. But are those statistics really any good? I don't know. Maybe. But, at least give him credit for using statistics, even if he's making them up. Half the women who fall do so under the influence of wine. I don't know what he's talking about here. I don't know what this means, to be perfectly honest. Women who fall, is that like infidelity? I don't know. This is like the 1890s, so like maybe there's some prudism here as well. Nearly all visits to disorderly houses are paid by men who are intoxicated. That one's probably true. Or at least it was back then. I'll take his word for that one, that most guys who rock up to, a prostitution establishment are or will quickly become intoxicated in some way. I buy that, right? People know this capacity of wine to stifle the voice of conscience and intentionally use it for that purpose. Right, so this is like the other side of the coin, right? He first introduced this idea that wine can, or that intoxicating substances can quiet the voice of conscience as a sort of remedy after you've already done something bad. But now he's alluding to the fact that a lot of people use it for that purpose before they do something that normally they wouldn't want to do, right? So, like going to the strip club or something, right? Not only do people stupefy themselves to stifle their own consciences, but knowing how wine acts, they intentionally stupefy others when they wish to make them commit actions contrary to conscience. Getting somebody drunk or attempting to get somebody drunk so that X can happen or Y can happen. I think that's pretty common. Awful, criminal in many cases, but people sure do it, right? That is, they arrange to stupefy people in order to deprive them of conscience. Yeah, people do that. And he doesn't give, the first thought that came to mind for me was things like sexual assault, where that's like, in a party where people are trying to get other people drunk and do things that, or trying to get others to do things that they wouldn't do when they were sober, right? And of course they're drunk too, right? And they might not encourage others to do those things if they themselves were not drunk as well. So that's a big mess, but he's got some other examples, right? In war, soldiers are usually intoxicated before a hand-to-hand fight. All of the French soldiers in the assaults on Sevastopol were drunk. Is that true? I don't know. I mean, I believe it, but I don't really know about drug usage on the front lines of major wars. I mean, I'd buy it, I believe it, but I would need to do a little more research to accept that. So, he's kind of striking out with me on the statistical basis for the case that he's making here. But, I wouldn't be surprised if some of these come out like mostly true. When a fortified place has been captured but the soldiers do not sack it and slay the defenseless old men and children, orders are often given to make them drunk, and they do what is expected of them. The Wikisource version has a footnote there, so maybe that would be helpful to consult. But again, like, citation please. Like, I don't, I haven't heard of deliberately getting your soldiers drunk so they'll do awful things. Maybe there's maybe there's stories of that in Herodotus. Maybe. I vaguely remember stuff like that, but yeah, we'd have to look that up. Everyone knows people who have taken to drink in consequence of some wrongdoing that has tormented their consciousness. Anyone can notice that those who lead immoral lives are more attracted than others by stupefying substances. Bands of robbers or thieves and prostitutes cannot live without intoxicants. Really? I mean, I guess so. Like, does substance abuse tend to track immorality? That would be the claim, right? That's the claim. That's what he's saying, right? That substance use tracks people who tend to leave more immoral lives. Again, I believe it, but I would like to see some data. Right? He said so many sentences start. Everyone knows. Everyone knows. Everyone agrees. Right? Don't write like this, by the way. Don't do philosophy like this. This is not the way things are done nowadays. But it's Tolstoy, so who am I to critique his writing, really? Everyone knows and admits that the use of stupefying substances is a consequence of the pangs of conscience, and that in certain immoral ways of life, stupefying substances are employed to stifle conscience. Everyone knows and admits also that the use of stupefiers does stifle conscience, that a drunken man is capable of deeds which, when sober, he would not think for a moment. Okay, that's the thesis. That's what he's trying to establish. I think it's clear enough at this point. Everyone agrees to this, but strange to say, when the use of stupefyers does not result in such deeds as thefts, murders, violations, and so forth, when stupefyers are taken not after some terrible crimes, but by men following professions which we do not consider criminal, and when the substances are consumed not in large quantities at once, but continually in moderate doses, then it is assumed that stupefying substances have no tendency to stifle conscience. Okay, so now he's slightly complicating things, right? So before, the case was these very sort of obvious examples of people doing awful things under the influence. And the idea is that, well, either you drink after you do something awful to not feel so good, or to not feel so bad about it, at least temporarily, right? It doesn't really work for that long, but that's, oh, I just lost my job, I'm going to go get drunk. Or they do it before they go and do something awful. And, we can think of all sorts of examples. He gave a couple, but now he's moving to cases where it seems like people are drinking not for those reasons because they're not doing things that are that bad, or they're not responding to actions that they have done that are all that bad. So he's talking about more everyday uses of stupefying substances. Thus, it is supposed that a well-to-do Russian's glass of vodka before each meal and a tumbler of wine with the meal, or a Frenchman's absinthe, or an Englishman's port wine and porter, or a German's lager beer, or a well-to-do Chinaman's moderate dose of opium, and the smoking of tobacco with them, is done only for pleasure and has no effect whatever on these people's consciences. So that's the counter-argument, right? So this is a counter-argument, really, to his position. And he's using it as a way to deal with more everyday, trickier cases, right? So he's made the obvious case first, and now he's sort of introducing an objection. It's like, well, what about this sort of, the people who just have a glass of wine with dinner, right? What about those people? Is their usage explained also by this idea of dulling our conscience so we can be more permissive of activities that we wouldn't normally do or approve of if we were totally sober? Right? And he's saying that some people might say that model doesn't work, for the guy who just wants a glass of wine with dinner. It is supposed that if after this customary stupefaction no crime is committed, no theft or murder, but only customary bad and stupid actions, right? So, falling down or whatever, then these actions have occurred of themselves and are not evoked by the stupefaction, right? So people are less willing to attribute mild indiscretions to being a little tipsy than, oh man, that guy got totally wasted and, did something really bad, right? It is supposed that if these people have not committed offenses against the criminal law, they have no need to stifle the voice of conscience, and that the life led by people who habitually stupefy themselves is quite a good life, and would be precisely the same if they did not stupefy themselves. it is supposed that the constant use of stupefyers does not in the least darken their consciences. Right, so this is setting up the opposing position, right? How people who say, no, I have a beer every night before bed, or, oh, no, I have my smoke in the morning and smoke in the evening, or whatever. No, I take a couple gummies and, before bed and it helps me sleep, or whatever, right? And it doesn't, I don't do that to dull my conscience or whatever the hell Tolstoy is talking about here so I can go out and murder people and do bad stuff, right? That's not why I have a glass of wine with dinner or whatever, right? That's not why I do it. And that's what he's sort of setting up here. Though everybody knows by experience that a man's frame of mind is altered by the use of wine or tobacco, that he is not ashamed of things which but for the stimulant he would be ashamed of, that after each twinge of conscience, however slight, he is inclined to have recourse to some stupefier, and that under the influence of stupefyers it is difficult to reflect on his life and position, and that the constant and regular use of stupefyers produces the same psychological effect as its occasional immoderate use does. Yet in spite of all this, it seems to men who drink and smoke moderately that they use stupefyers not at all to stifle conscience, but only for the flavor or for the pleasure. Right, so this is sort of turning the objection on its head and saying, yeah, you might say that, oh, I don't have a glass of wine with dinner in order to dull my conscience, but they won't deny that that's exactly what it does, right? Like, that's what smoking and drinking does. It does so in these more extreme cases, and it does so even if on a more mild level in the mild use cases. And that's Tolstoy's point. Right? He says, well, even if you think that you're not doing it for that reason, it's still doing that. And the evidence is it doing that in these very obvious cases, right? It doesn't stop doing that completely just because you're doing it on a lower level. It just doesn't work that way, right? If you're putting any alcohol or any mind-altering substance into your system whatsoever, you are dulling your conscience in the same way that you would be if you were to ingest a lot of it, right? It would be a difference of degree, but it would still be a dulling of the conscience. Again, just, that's Tolstoy's argument, right? That's what he's saying here. But one need only think of the matter seriously and impartially, not trying to excuse oneself, to understand. Right, so now he's, again, he put a bunch of stuff in this paragraph, and now he's going to sort of unpack it a little bit for us, right? And so he makes these 3 points here, right? First, that if the use of stupefyers in large, occasional doses stifles man's conscience, their regular use must have a like effect, always first intensifying and then dulling the activity of the brain. And he's, talking about the intensifying is the getting drunk, and then the dulling is the hangover, right? That's what he means by always first intensifying and then dulling the activity of the brain, right? And his point is that, well, whether you drink a ton or just a little bit, this always happens, right? You feel a little tipsy, and then you feel a little woozy, right, as your brain processes, or as your body processes the liquor or whatever, right? Whether they are taken in large or small doses, that always happens. Secondly, that all stupefyers have the quality of stifling conscience, right? And that's like the main thesis, right? That all stupefyers, no matter what kind they are, and no matter how much you do, they do this, right? They dull the voice in your head that has a pretty good idea of what you should or shouldn't do, right? That's what it does. It shuts down that voice, or it not completely shuts it down, but it dulls it, it quiets it, at least temporarily, and that's why men stupefy themselves, according to Tolstoy, right? So he has to make the case that this happens even in moderate usage. All stupefyers have the quality of stifling conscience and have this always inherently, both when under their influence, murders, robberies, and violations are committed, and when under their influence words are spoken which would not have been spoken, or things are thought and felt which but for them would not have been thought and felt. Right? So he's talking, he's not just talking about the murders and the robberies and, the awful things that people do when they're drunk, but also just saying something stupid, being a little bit rude, thinking some thought that isn't very, morally good, and not immediately shutting it down, right? Your conscience is dulled when you drink, even in small quantities. And when you do any sort of stupefying substance, Tolstoy would argue, right? Thirdly, that if the use of stupefyers is needed to pacify and stifle the consciences of thieves, robbers, and prostitutes, it is also wanted by people engaged in occupations condemned by their own consciences, even though these occupations may be considered proper and honorable by other people. That's interesting. So he's kind of making a socio-economic claim here that people drink to dull their conscience, even in cases where they're not breaking any laws, right? People do all sorts of bad things that aren't nearly as bad as murdering and stealing and things like that, right? You could, maybe you have a job that requires a little bit of deception, right? Or maybe you have a job that requires treating people poorly. You have to, restructure a company and you have to fire a bunch of people that work below you or something. That could weigh on your conscience. You could have a rough day at work. You could have made a mistake, right? There's all sorts of reasons you might want to dull your conscience, not just because you're, out murdering and stealing, right? There could be, other sorts of things that you kind of have to do and your conscience isn't happy with it. And so you turn to dulling your conscience by drinking or whatever, right? In a word, it is impossible to avoid understanding that the use of stupefyers in large or small amounts, occasionally or regularly, in the higher or lower circles of society, is evoked by and the same cause. The need to stifle the voice of conscience in order not to be aware of the discord existing between one's way of life and the demands of one's conscience. Right, so again, the claim is just that I've made the case where people do crazy shit when they're stoned and drunk or whatever, right? That's an easy case. And I'm also saying that that same thing is happening even on a lower level, just on a lower level, even with people who just, habitually smoke and drink in small amounts, right? Even people who are moderate smokers and drinkers, the same sort of process is going on, right? It's extreme in those cases with robbers and people who lead really bad lives. But even people who, I just have a glass of wine with dinner, that's still what's happening. That's still why they do it, because the effect of the chemical is the same in all cases, right? It dulls the conscience. That's what it does. Whether it's an extreme case or a benign case, that's what it's doing. Section 3. In that alone lies the reason of the widespread use of all stupefying substances, and among the rest of tobacco, probably the most generally used and most harmful. This is super interesting. This is way before we knew about lung cancer and smoking, right? But Tolstoy is out here saying nope, everybody does this and it's terrible, right? It is bad. And so he's going to talk about tobacco in this section from now on. It is supposed that tobacco cheers one up, clears the thoughts, and attracts one merely like any other habit, without at all producing the deadening of conscience produced by wine. But you need only observe attentively the conditions under which a special desire to smoke arises, and you will be convinced that stupefying with tobacco acts on the conscience as wine does, and that people consciously have recourse to this method of stupefaction just when they require it for that purpose. So this is like really fascinating, because he's saying that, even though tobacco works with a completely different mechanism of compared to alcohol or opium or whatever the drug might be, even though it's very different in terms of its chemical effect, the goal is still to just turn down one's conscience. That's still what it does. And it does so in a really precise way. And also, the reasons that people give for smoking tobacco is also bullshit, according to Tolstoy. If tobacco merely cleared the thoughts and cheered one up, there would not be such a passionate craving for it, a craving showing itself just on certain definite occasions. People would not say, as they do, that they would rather go without bread than without tobacco, and would not often actually prefer tobacco to food. Now, as an observation, yeah, I think that's true. People, some people will prefer a smoke to eating during lunchtime, right? The desire to smoke cigarettes, smoke tobacco is quite strong. And nowadays, I think the population of like smoking, cigarette smokers is going down. But nowadays we have all this vaping stuff, which is like the same thing, right? It's nicotine at the end of the day. And that's the chemical, that's the reason why, that's the stupefying substance, right, that people use it for. So, we can insert, vape for tobacco here, and the argument would still work. Because again, this is supposed to be an argument sort of regardless of the specific chemical, neurological mechanism for the stupefying itself. The effect, the net effect, spiritually and psychologically, is that it dulls the conscience. That cook who murdered his mistress said that when he entered the bedroom and gashed her throat with a knife, and she had fallen with a rattle in her throat, and the blood had gushed out in a torrent, he lost his courage. I could not finish her off, he said, but I went back from the bedroom to the sitting room and sat down there and smoked a cigarette. Yeah, okay, so there's Tolstoy doing his writing, right? He's pretty good at telling a story. He's a pretty good storyteller. Very graphic, a little brutal, right? But the point is, right, there are cases where smoking a cigarette in a very stressful situation is like very common. I remember there was I watched a documentary about there was another serial killer. I forget his name, but there are stories of I think he killed his mother, and after he had done the deed, he went in the other room and smoked 2 packs of cigarettes, and like that was like, I remember him saying that in the story, and then went back and I guess cleaned up the scene or whatever, right? But so I thought of that instantly when Tolstoy gave this story, and maybe I'm sure if you're up on your true crime stories, that you can think of similar examples, right? And the point is, only after stupefying himself with tobacco was he able to return to the bedroom, finish cutting the old lady's throat, and began examining her things. Evidently, the desire to smoke at that moment was evoked in him, not by a wish to clear his thoughts or to be merry, but by the need to stifle something that prevented him from completing what he had planned to do. So this is supposed to be like proof that, even if people say things like, oh, I smoke to clear my head or whatever, very often smoking in between 2 intense moments in a larger event serves the function of punctuating those 2 events, right? You do something very stressful, and then you just go and have a cigarette and calm down, relax, readjust, or whatever the psychological, whatever explanation you give, and then you return to the the very difficult task that you needed to take a break from. Tolstoy would say, because your conscience was getting in the way of you just moving forward. Any smoker may detect in himself the same definite desire to stupefy himself with tobacco at certain, specially difficult moments. I look back at the days when I used to smoke. When was it that I felt this special need of tobacco? It was always at moments when I did not wish to remember certain things that presented themselves to my recollection, or when I wished to forget or not to think. And so he gives a couple examples here, right? But the idea was, there was something I was trying to turn off when I really wanted a cigarette. There was something bothering me, and I just wanted to turn it off. And that thing that was bothering me was my conscience. So he gives some examples. I sit by myself doing nothing, and I know I ought to set to work, but I just don't feel inclined to. So I smoke and go on sitting. Relatable, right? I'm sitting there, I'm doing nothing, like a lump. I ain't doing shit. I'm feeling lazy. I know I should be doing something, but I don't feel like it. So I just smoke. And I feel like I'm doing something for at least a couple minutes, and then I don't feel so bad about doing nothing, at least for a little bit. So I bought myself some more time before my conscience becomes so overwhelming that I actually just have to start doing something. Right? I've promised to be at somebody's house by 5 o'clock, but I've stayed too long somewhere else. I remember that I've missed the appointment, and I don't want to remember it, so I smoke. Right? I feel bad because I messed up this sort of benign thing, right? I missed an appointment. I need a cigarette. Right? That's pretty relatable. I get vexed and say unpleasant things to someone, and I know I'm doing wrong and see that I ought to stop, but I want to give vent to my irritability. So I smoke and continue to be irritable. Right? So you're really pissed off about something. You're like, I'm so uncomfortable. I'm so upset. I'm going to go smoke and fume about it. Right? I'm going to go be upset while I'm smoking or vaping or whatever it is. Right? I play at cards and I lose more than I intended to risk. So I smoke. I've placed myself in an awkward position. I've acted badly. I've made a mistake, and I ought to acknowledge the mess I'm in and thus escape from it, but I don't want to acknowledge it. So I accuse others and smoke. I write something that I'm not quite satisfied with what I have written. I ought to abandon it, but I wish to finish what I have planned to do, so I smoke. I dispute, and I see that my opponent and I do not understand and cannot understand one another, but I wish to express my opinion, so I continue to talk, and I smoke. Right? Not all of these are equally relatable to me personally, but a couple of them kind of hit the nail on the head. And that's pretty, this guy's really perceptive. What distinguishes tobacco from most other stupefyers, besides the ease with which one can stupefy oneself with it and its apparent harmlessness, and its portability, is its portability and the possibility of applying it to meet small, isolated occurrences that disturb someone. Right? So there are lots of small, isolated disturbances that occur throughout the day that, I said something wrong, or like any of these issues above, right, that he just mentioned, right? I missed an appointment, but I stayed too long somewhere else, and I feel bad about, blowing off that person. So I'm going to smoke about it. I'm not going to go get drunk about it, right? That's not worth getting drunk over, but that is worth having a cigarette over, right? That's the idea, right? That you can use tobacco, or nicotine, I guess is the more general drug, to meet small, isolated occurrences of disturbance. Not to mention that the use of opium, wine, and hashish involves the use of certain appliances not always at hand, while one can always carry tobacco and paper with one, and that the opium smoker and the drunkard evoke horror, while the tobacco smoker does not seem at all repulsive. The advantage of tobacco over other stupefyers is that the stupefaction of opium, hashish, or wine extends to all sensations and acts received or produced during a certain somewhat extended period of time, while the stupefaction from tobacco can be directed to any separate occurrence. Okay, so he writes really long sentences, right? But the idea is basically that it's easier and less all-encompassing to use tobacco, right? Because it's small, it's portable, everybody does it. At least back in those days, it's not as ugly, right? You don't really get whacked out of it when you're smoking a cigarette, right? Compared to like when you're smoking some hard drugs or getting really drunk, right? When you engage in more extreme forms of stupefaction, the results are more extreme as a result, obviously, right? Whereas cigarettes, smoking tobacco, it's a bit more benign and it's a bit more precise. Again, you get some mild inconvenience. I'm going to go smoke a cigarette about that. I'm not going to go get wasted about that. If there's anything else like this today, I guess it would be like some forms of marijuana, right? I guess like, or THC, right? Gummies. People carry gummies all the time nowadays. You wish to do what you ought not to do, so you smoke a cigarette and stupefy yourself sufficiently to enable you to do what should not be done, and then you are supposedly all right again and can think and speak clearly. So again, the part of the strategy of this of his argument here is to look at the obvious examples first and then sort of convince you that a smaller version of that very same thing is going on in these more isolated and benign seeming cases, right? That really what, the person who goes out and murders people and gets drunk before they do it so they don't have to feel so bad about it in the act, that's like the same sort of thing that we do when, we want to go on being angry with somebody and have a cigarette to distract ourselves and reduce the effects of our conscience, right? So that's like the general strategy, that the stuff that goes on in the really obvious cases is also going on in these unobvious cases because the function of the substance is the same. Right, okay. But apart from individual cases in which every smoker has recourse to smoking, not to satisfy a habit or to while away the time, but as a means of stifling his conscience with reference to acts he is about to commit or has already committed, is it not quite evident that there's a strict and definite relation between men's way of life and their passion for smoking? So now we're going to do some, he's going to talk about how people's behaviors in other areas of life tend to influence their proclivity to smoking. Right, so when do lads begin to smoke? Usually when they lose their childish innocence. How is it that smokers can abandon smoking when they come along? Or how is it that smokers can abandon smoking when they come along more moral conditions of life, and again start smoking as soon as they fall among a depraved set? Why do gamblers almost all smoke? And why among women do those who lead a regular life smoke least? Why do prostitutes and madmen all smoke? Right. So again, this idea that you can sort of infer who's likely to be a smoker based on the sort of life they lead. I'll leave it to you to decide if that empirically is true in your experience, but that's Tolstoy's claim. Habit is habit, but evidently smoking stands in some definite connection with the craving to stifle conscience and achieves the end required of it, right? So it works. That's why people do it. They do it to shut up their conscience, whether it's about something big or small, about something they're about to do or already did do, whether it's for a minute or for a day, right? Whether it's with cigarettes or liquor, that's what it does. It works, and that's why we do it. So one may observe, in the case of almost every smoker, to what an extent smoking drowns the voice of conscience. Okay, so now he's going to start like just full on smoker shaming, right? Every smoker, when yielding to his desires, forgets or sets at naught the very first demands of social life, demands he expects others to observe and which he observes in all other cases until his conscience is stifled by tobacco. Well, he'll go on to explain. Everyone of average education considers it inadmissible, ill-bred, and inhumane to infringe on the peace, comfort, and still more the health of others for his own pleasure. Right? So everybody agrees that we shouldn't go around harming others just for our own pleasure. No one would allow himself to wet a room. I don't know what that means. To wet a room in which people are sitting. I don't know. Does that mean like just getting in the middle of a room and pissing on people? Like, I don't know what to wet a room means. That's an old turn of phrase, I guess. Or to make a noise, shout, let in the cold, hot, or ill-smelling air, or commit acts that incommode. Oh, that's a new word. Incommode or harm others. But out of 1,000 smokers, not one will shrink from producing unwholesome smoke in a room where the air is breathed by non-smoking women and children. Right? So this is very interesting. He's talking about secondhand smoke. He's saying that secondhand smoke is harmful, and it's 1890, right? Which just goes to show that like this is pretty obvious to everybody. Like everybody knows that like breathing in cigarette smoke all the time is just not good, even if you're not actually smoking. So like, pretty cool. And he's writing in a time where like it was much more common for people to smoke inside, and just smoke nonstop inside in the company of others, regardless of who smoked. I mean, if you watch old Hollywood movies, you still get some of this, right, where people are smoking in every single room on the set. In the 70s, people were still smoking everywhere. You had smoking and non-smoking sections in restaurants. And most places in the world, I think nowadays, have seriously cut back on how much that's tolerated now. It's a little less common in Asia, I think. In Asia, you can find a lot more tolerance for indoor smoking venues, at least in my experience, and maybe some other parts of the world as well. But at least in North America, I think it's I can't imagine many places that still allow smoking indoors. Right, but at least when Tolstoy was writing, it was very common, and he's saying that if you want to talk about stifling conscience, right, for this, in the service of a stupefying substance, or relying on a stupefying substance to stifle your conscience, think about just how utterly inconsiderate it is to smoke in front of people who don't smoke, right, in the same room, who have to breathe that air with you, right? It's just really not nice. It's not nice. If smokers do usually say to those present, "Oh, you don't object?" everyone knows that the customary answer is no, not at all, right? Although it cannot be pleasant to a non-smoker to breathe tainted air and to find stinking cigar ends in glasses and cups or on plates and candlesticks or ash pans, right? Right. The idea is like, of course, it's on everybody else to say no. Of course, you could smoke, right? It's they're the ones who have to be polite in this situation, where the smokers get to just say, "Oh, you don't mind if I smoke, do you?" And it's like, well, of course I do, because I don't smoke, and it's disgusting and awful, and I hate the smell, and it's probably hurting me. But no, of course, go ahead. I don't mind, right? That's weird. That's weird, according to Tolstoy. But even if non-smoking adults did not object to tobacco smoke, it could not be pleasant or good for the children whose consent no one asks. Yet people who are honorable and humane in all other respects smoke in the presence of children, at dinner, in small rooms, vitiating the air with tobacco smoke without feeling the slightest twinge of conscience. Right? So like people who are normally show very good judgment in many areas of life are fine with just smoking in front of kids, right? Or in the car with kids, right? Maybe that would be a modern example. Although I guess people don't really smoke in their cars that much anymore anyway. I don't even think they put ashtrays in car doors anymore. I guess that hasn't been true for a while. It is usually said, and I used to say, that smoking facilitates mental work. And this is fun. And that is undoubtedly true if one considers only the quantity of mental output. To a man who smokes, and who consequently ceases strictly to appraise and weighs his thoughts, it seems as if he suddenly had many thoughts. But this is not because he really has many thoughts, but only because he has lost control of his thoughts. So now he's speaking as a writer. Right now he's talking about his own personal experience as a smoker and as a writer. And he's talking about how people say, like, oh, I need to smoke because it stimulates my thoughts, right? And you see this a lot. People make this claim, the sort of classic writing trope high achiever types will have in the past said on many occasions that, oh, smoking helps me think, it helps me produce more, helps me do my work more effectively, right? People smoke and work, and nicotine is a stimulant, so of course, it feels that way. And Tolstoy saying, yeah, I used to think that too, but now I'm convinced it's all bullshit. Here's why. When a man works, he is always conscious of two beings in himself. The one works, the other appraises the work. The stricter the appraisement, the slower and the better is the work, and vice versa. When the appraiser is under the influence of something that stupefies him, more work gets done, but its quality is poorer. So that's the claim, right? You do more, but it's not as good. If I do not smoke, I cannot write. I cannot get on. I begin and I cannot continue. That's what is usually said. And what I used to say, right? Because Tolstoy used to smoke and then he quit. What does it really mean? Well, it means either that you have nothing to write, or that what you wish to write has not yet matured in your consciousness, but is only beginning dimly to present itself to you, and the appraising critic within, when not stupefied with tobacco, tells you so. If you did not smoke, you would either abandon what you have begun, or you would wait until your thought has cleared itself in your mind. You would try to penetrate into what presents itself dimly to you, would consider the objections that offer themselves, and would turn all your attention to the elucidation of the thought. But you smoke. The critic within you is stupefied, and the hindrance to your work is removed. What seemed insignificant to you when not inebriated by tobacco again seems important, and what seemed obscure no longer seems so. The objections that presented themselves vanish, and you continue to write, and write much and rapidly. A couple examples of this, I think are pretty solid in history. So like Jean-Paul Sartre, for example. A lot of writing, a lot of cigarettes, I think lots of speed too. I think he was also like into speed or amphetamines or something. But guy wrote a whole bunch of stuff, and people love it, but not all of it is of the same quality. And I'm sure if Tolstoy was around to read it, he would say the same thing. This guy, I don't know what he's smoking, but probably a lot of cigarettes and whatever else it may be. And the idea, again, is that smoking, just like any stupefying substance, gets rid of conscience. And in this case, in the creative process or in any sort of labor of the mind, conscience isn't like moral conscience. It's more of like an appraisal of the quality, right? Where you might have some idea that's like sort of suggestive and might be promising, but there's another voice in your head that says, no, that's probably not going to work, or it has these problems, this has problem X, Y, and Z, and maybe that's not gonna, maybe we shouldn't follow through with that, maybe we should get rid of that idea, maybe we should move on, try something else, right? But when you smoke, everything that idea sounds really good, and I'm going to write about that one, or I'm going to pursue that idea, because that little voice in my head that said, maybe it's bullshit, has shut up. That's the idea. Okay, section 4. Right. Well, before that, and as a result, we write a lot, right? Or we'll do a lot of work, but it might not be of the best quality because we're not quite as critical of it. That's the idea. Section 4. Okay, but can such a trifling alteration as the slight intoxication produced by the moderate use of wine or tobacco produce important consequences, right? He's saying like, well, do these minor uses of these substances really have as big an impact on our lives as I'm suggesting they are? That's the question he's going to answer in this section, or at least argue for. And his answer is yes. Yes, they are that big. And he goes on to introduce the objection, right? And this is in quotes, right? If a man smokes opium or hashish or intoxicates himself with wine till he falls down and loses his senses, of course the consequences may be very serious. But it surely cannot have any serious consequences if a man merely comes slightly under the influence of hops or tobacco. That's what's usually said. It seems to people that a slight stupefaction, a little darkening of the judgment, cannot have any important influence. But to think so is like supposing that it may harm a watch to be struck against a stone, but that a little dirt introduced into the watch cannot be harmful, right? So, and of course he's talking about a mechanical analog watch, right? Which is a very intricate and precise mechanism with all sorts of very small parts. And he says, well, you know, if you say that the little stuff can't affect it, while admitting that the big stuff can affect it, that's just like saying, well, I could smash a watch, but if I just put a little bit of sand in the gears, that's not going to do anything. Not very persuasive reasoning, and that's the analogy. Remember, however, that the chief work actuating a man's whole life is not done by his hands, his feet, or his back, but by his consciousness. Before a man can do anything with his feet or hands, a certain alteration has first to take place in his consciousness. Oh, sorry. What did I... okay. Sorry, I lost my place. Yep. And this alteration defines all the subsequent movements of the man. Yet these alterations are always minute and almost imperceptible, right? So he's talking about, he says that, like, basically the small adjustments we make in our thinking that ends up determining what we do have massive consequences, right? That the way we come to a decision about what to do relies on features and movements in our consciousness that are very small and precise and almost imperceptible, right? It's like just, you know, slight perceptions of the situation, and, you know, just especially when we're undecided about doing something, it doesn't, you know, it's amazing just how small and fine-grained the features of the situation that we focus on that get us to do A or B really are. Bruyulov? I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce that. My Russian is non-existent. He's a painter, though. He's a painter. One day corrected a pupil's study. The pupil, having glanced at the altered drawing, exclaimed, Why, you only touched a tiny bit, but it is quite another thing, right? So this artist had a pupil, and the pupil made a painting, right? And Bruyov, the teacher, walks over and just like fixes one little thing, and all of a sudden the painting looks very, very different. And the student says, wow, that's, you know, all you did was touch this one little thing, and now the painting looks totally different. And he replied, well, art begins where the tiny bit begins, right? So this idea that even the smallest changes can have massive consequences. It's not quite as crazy as like a butterfly effect sort of claim. But the idea is still that, you know, the devil is in the details, so to speak, right? And this saying is strikingly true not only of art, but of all life. One may say that true life begins where the tiny bit begins, where what seems to us minute and infinitely small alterations take place. True life is not lived where great external changes take place, where people move about, clash, fight, and slay one another. It is lived only where these tiny, tiny, infinitesimally small changes occur. So that's the thesis, right? This idea that, you know, the very small decisions that we make affect our lives in substantial ways. Raskolnikov, who is a character in a novel by Dostoevsky, another Russian author. I forget which one. No, I can't remember. I forget which one. But he's a character in a Russian novel, a Russian literary work, right? Raskolnikov did not live his true life when he murdered the old woman or her sister. When murdering the old woman herself, and still more while murdering her sister, he did not live his true life, but acted like a machine, doing what he could not help doing, discharging the cartridge with which he had long been loaded. One old woman was killed, another stood before him, the axe was in his hand. Right? So the idea is that when he actually did the deed, right, he wasn't really living. He was sort of just going through the motions, unloading a cartridge that was already loaded in to himself, right? Raskolnikov lived his true life not when he met the old woman's sister, but at the time when he had not yet killed any old woman, nor entered a stranger's lodging with intent to kill, nor held the axe in his hand, nor had the loop in his overcoat by which the axe hung. Right? So before all that stuff happened, that's when he was living his true life. Right? He lived his true life when he was lying on the sofa in his room, deliberating not at all about the old woman, nor even as to whether it is or is not permissible at the will of one man to wipe from the face of the earth another, to murder, right? Unnecessary and harmful man, but whether he ought to live in St. Petersburg or not, whether he ought to accept money from his mother or not, and on other questions not at all relating to the old woman. And then, in that region quite independent of animal activities, the question whether he would or would not kill the old woman was decided. That question was decided not when, having killed the old woman, he stood before another, axe in hand, but when he was doing nothing and only thinking, when only his consciousness was active, and in that consciousness tiny, tiny alterations were taking place. I'll just keep going before I summarize. It is at such times that one needs the greatest clearness of mind to decide correctly the questions that have arisen, and it is just then that one glass of beer or one cigarette may prevent the solution of the question, may postpone the decision, stifle the voice of conscience, and prompt a decision of the question in favor of the lower animal nature, as was the case with Raskolnikov. Right? So, the argument here, to go through it, is basically that, many of our decisions are the result of very small or small seeming activities in the mind or of our consciousness. And even the biggest decisions, like to murder somebody, right? Which is a pretty big decision. Because it's so clearly wrong. If you decide to do it, usually it's not an easy decision to make, unless, of course, you're messed up on drugs and alcohol, right? Then it dulls the conscience enough for you to decide, I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it. I'll drink for the courage, and I'll get the deed done, right? And then, actually, I think the next paragraph sort of says this in a way that's pretty clear. Tiny, tiny alterations, right? That's what determines what we do. But on them depend the most immense and terrible consequences. Many material changes may result from what happens when a man has taken a decision and begun to act. Houses, riches, and people's bodies may perish, but nothing more important can happen than what was hidden in the man's consciousness. The limits of what can happen are set by consciousness. Right? So the idea is that, and it's kind of so obvious that it's like shocking that he's making it, but it's shocking that he's making this point, but it's also not really talked about and totally ignored when we're trying to justify getting drunk or something, right? Which is just the very simple fact that Um, you know, stupefying ourselves makes us do stupid things, right? When we need all of our mental faculties and energies the most, right? When we're in difficult situations, when we're stressed, when we're not sure what to do, when we are wrestling with our conscience about something, that's usually when people reach for a beer or a smoke. And that's when you need to be doing that stuff the very least, because you need your conscience to help guide you through the situation more than you do in other circumstances. So why on earth would you drink when you need to make an important decision or deal with an uncomfortable issue, right? Or make a huge commitment, right? Why on earth would you not want all of your mental abilities when you're making any decision, really? Because some of those decisions could be massively consequential. And boundless results of unimaginable importance may follow from the most minute alterations occurring in the domain of consciousness. Okay, so that's the claim. Is that true? I don't know. It's interesting. But that's my take on what's going on here. Now, of course, now he's talking to the philosophers. Do not let it be supposed that what I am saying has anything to do with questions of free will or determinism. Discussion on that question is superfluous for my purpose, or for any other for that matter. So, clearly, Tolstoy is not very impressed with the question of free will versus determinism. He doesn't think it matters here or in any other context. It just doesn't matter. Interesting. Thanks, Tolstoy. So Leo was not worried about whether or not free will or determinism was true. Without deciding the question whether a man can or cannot act as he wishes, a question in my opinion not correctly stated, I am merely saying that since human activity is conditioned by infinitesimal alterations in consciousness, it follows, no matter whether we admit the existence of free will or not, that we must pay particular attention to the condition in which these minute alterations take place, just as one might be specially attentive to the condition of scales on which other things are to be weighed. Right. So again, the idea is that, well, given that basically everything we do is a function of our consciousness, we should try not to dull our senses, because that could have pretty bad consequences. It's probably something a little deeper than that. I feel like the way I just phrased it made it seem like totally obvious. But maybe he is talking about something totally obvious that it's kind of amazing that we don't all agree with, because we all go out and get drunk, right? We must, as far as it depends on us, try to put ourselves and others in conditions which will not disturb the clearness and delicacy of thought necessary for the correct working of conscience, and must not act in the contrary manner, trying to hinder and confuse the work of conscience by the use of stupefying substances, right? So take our clarity of mind seriously, because it's really important that we think clearly all the time. Again, pretty obvious, but he's sort of working this conclusion into his theory of what it means to be human. And as he goes on, right? For a man is spiritual as well as an animal being. He may be moved by the things that influence his spiritual nature, or by the things that influence his animal nature, as a clock may be moved by its hands or by its main wheel. Again, he's talking about analog clocks, right? So they have a mechanism on the inside, or you can manually turn the hands yourself if you want to. If the clock dies and you need to reset the time, you can move the hands. But the way it's supposed to work is by the internal mechanism moving the whole clock face all at once. And just as it is best to regulate the movement of a clock by means of its inner mechanism, so a man, oneself or another, is best regulated by means of his consciousness. And as with a clock, one has to take special care of that part by means of which one can best move the inner mechanism, so with a man one must take special care of the cleanness and clearness of consciousness, which is the thing that best moves the whole man. Right? So this analogy with a clock. Right? Where, there's a way that we're supposed to guide our actions, and it's one that emphasizes the importance of our conscience, right, which tells us right and wrong, and our consciousness, which guides all of our actions. Right? I make a decision to do something. When I make that decision happens in between my ears. It happens in my brain at the microscopic level, and then I decide to do the thing. There's a way that process is supposed to work, and it's based on some truths which are spiritual in nature, at least according to Tolstoy, and we really shouldn't mess with that. Right? We shouldn't try deliberately to throw sand in the gears of how that process works. To doubt this is impossible. Everyone knows it. But a need to deceive oneself arises. People are not as anxious that consciousness should work correctly as they are that it should seem to them that what they are doing is right. And they deliberately make use of substances that disturb the proper working of their consciousness. That is a very nice line. That is quotable, right? People are not as anxious that consciousness should work correctly as they are that it should seem to them that what they are doing is right. Right? People are more concerned about justifying their actions than they are about making sure that what they're doing is right, or then guiding their actions in accordance with what they know to be right. They're more interested in justifying what they've done, by making it seem like it's right, or by deadening our sense of right and wrong altogether, right? And how do we do that? Well, by deliberately making use of substances that disturb the proper working of consciousness. Okay, got a bit more here. People drink and smoke, not casually, not from dullness, not to cheer themselves up, not because it is pleasant, but in order to drown the voice of conscience in themselves. And in that case, how terrible must be the consequences. Right? To think, I'll just keep reading. Think what a building would be like erected by people who did not use a straight plumb rule to get the walls perpendicular, nor a right-angled square to get the corners correct, but used a soft rule which would bend to suit all irregularities in the walls, and a square that expanded to fit any angle, acute or obtuse. Yet, thanks to self-stupefaction, that is just what is being done in life. Life does not accord with conscience, so conscience is made to bend to life. That's the idea. That's why we drink, right? Because what we do doesn't accord with right and wrong, so we bend our perception of right and wrong to align with what we've already done or with what we want to do. Right? That's why we do it. And one way of doing that is by using substances. This is done in the life of individuals, and it is done in the life of humanity as a whole, which consists of the lives of individuals. Well, of course. To grasp the full significance of such stupefying of one's consciousness, let each one carefully recall the spiritual conditions he has passed through at each period of his life. Everyone will find that at each period of his life certain moral questions confronted him which he ought to solve, and on the solution of which the whole welfare of his life depended. For the solution of these questions, great concentration of attention was needful. Such concentration of attention is a labor. In every labor, especially at the beginning, there is a time when the work seems difficult and painful, and when human weakness prompts a desire to abandon it. Physical work seems painful at first, mental work still more so. As Lessing says, people are inclined to cease to think at the point at which thought begins to be difficult. But it is just there, I would add, that the thinking begins to be fruitful. Right, so now he's saying that drinking and doing drugs or whatever helps us be lazy. Because very often there's stuff we don't want to do, we don't feel like dealing with. This is too hard. I just can't deal with this today. I just want to get drunk or have a cigarette. Right? A man feels that to decide these questions confronting him needs labor, often painful labor, and he wishes to evade this. If he had no means of stupefying his faculties, he could not expel from his consciousness the questions that confront him, and the necessity of solving them will be forced upon him. But man finds that there exists a means to drive off these questions whenever they present themselves, and he uses it. Right? So, we drink to get away from situations we don't like, especially those that require work, not just, wage labor kind of work, like going to work every day, but like working through moral problems and problems with relationships with others and obligations we have to deal with, right? Stupefying substances is a form of escape, right? Escape from what? What are we escaping from when we do escapism? A lot of people say escape from life, right? But that's not quite right, because escape from life is death, after all. Rather, according to Tolstoy, it's escape from our conscience, right? From the clear thinking that would let us know just how difficult and painful the situation really is. That's what we want to get away from. That's why we turn to substances. As soon as the questions awaiting solution begin to torment him, he has recourse to these means and avoids the disquietude evoked by troublesome questions. Consciousness ceases to demand their solution, and the unsolved questions remain unsolved till his next period of enlightenment. But when that period comes, the same thing is repeated, and the man goes on for months, years, or even for his whole life, standing before those same moral questions and not moving a step towards their solution. Yet it is in the solution of moral questions that life's whole movement consists. So that's pretty... Now he's sort of diagnosing problem substance users. Maybe that's not the right way to put it. But he's talking about the cumulative, lifelong effects of people who avoid dealing with issues by turning to some form of distraction or substance, right? He's focusing on substance, but there's other ways of not dealing with stuff, right? And his claim is simply, if you never deal with that stuff for whatever reason, then you never grow up, right? You never progress as a human being. You never move forward in life, right? What occurs is as if a man who needs to see the bottom of some muddy water to obtain a precious pearl, but who dislikes entering the water, should stir it up each time it begins to settle and become clear. Many a man continues to stupefy himself all his life long, and remains immovable at the same once accepted, obscure, self-contradictory view of life pressing, or of life. Pressing as each period of enlightenment approaches, ever at one and the same wall against which he pressed 10 or 20 years ago, and which he cannot break through because he intentionally blunts that sharp point of thought that could pierce it. Right? So if we never deal with our problems because we keep avoiding them, then we never progress. And that's to our own detriment, right? And very often, according to Tolstoy, right, this resistance to dealing with our problems takes the shape of stupefying ourselves, of using substances. Let each man remember himself as he has been during the years of his drinking or smoking, and let him test the matter in this experience of other people, and everyone will see a definite, constant line dividing those who are addicted to stupefiers from those who are free from them. The more a man stupefies himself, the more he is morally immovable. That's powerful, right? The idea that people who are wrapped up in their substances and addicted to the certain substances are in a state of arrested development because they don't deal with the issues that they have to deal with because they just get drunk, so they don't have to think about those anymore. Well, again, that's the argument. Not endorsing that, right? Almost sounds like, dare I say, victim blaming, right? Of nowadays people think that addiction, or people treat addiction as a disease, right? It needs treatment, it needs help. And I wouldn't be surprised if Tolstoy actually has a compassionate attitude towards people who are addicted to things. But he's more just, I don't think he's really making a moral judgment on people who are addicted to things. One reason for that being he himself was addicted to smoking, at least, which he admits in this article, right? So he's just cataloging what happens when people are habitually stupefying themselves, what happens on a moral and a spiritual level to them, in his opinion. Again, 1890, right? Terrible. Oh, this is section 6 now. Terrible, as they are described to us, are the consequences of opium and hashish on individual. Terrible, as we know them, are the consequences of alcohol to flagrant drunkards, but incomparably more terrible to our whole society are the consequences of what is considered the harmless, moderate use of spirits, wine, beer, and tobacco, to which the majority of men, and especially our so-called cultured classes, are addicted. So again, now he's not, and this is an important bit of the piece, right? He's not just talking about the addicts, right, whose lives are totally ruined by their usage of stupefying substances. He's talking about the everyday, common use of it by functional, well-to-do members of society. He thinks that is the really insidious stuff. He actually thinks that's worse than the cases of one person's whole life being consumed by a substance. The consequences must naturally be terrible, admitting the fact, which must be admitted, that the guiding activities of society, political, official, scientific, literary, and artistic, are carried on for the most part by people in an abnormal state, by people who are drunk. So the whole world is run by drunks. Did you know that? Right? By people who habitually drink, right? By people who kind of drink on the regular. Like most people in positions of power drink or do drugs, even if those drugs are prescribed by a doctor, right? Chew on that. It's pretty crazy. It is generally supposed that a man who, like most people of our well-to-do classes, takes alcoholic drink almost every time he eats, is in a perfectly normal and sober condition the next day during working hours, right? So people say, well, no, I have one drink with a meal and it doesn't affect me at all. But this is quite an error, according to Tolstoy. A man who drank a bottle of wine, a glass of spirits, or 2 glasses of ale yesterday is now in the usual state of drowsiness or depression which follows excitement, and is therefore in a condition of mental prostration, which is increased by smoking. For a man who habitually smokes and drinks in moderation, to bring his brain into a normal condition would require at least a week or more of abstinence from wine and tobacco, but that hardly ever occurs. That's the claim. And right now he's got this really fun footnote for philosophers, which he goes on. And it's an objection. He didn't put it in the main text, but it's the only footnote of his in this work. But to set up the idea is just that even people who seem to be like moderate drinkers, I drink and smoke on occasion, well, actually he's talking about the habitual, daily, but small quantity type of drinkers and smokers, and he says that is terrible. Like that's not good either, right? and he's got this footnote. But how is it that people who do not drink or smoke are often morally on an incomparably lower plane than others who do drink or smoke? And why do people who drink or smoke often manifest very high qualities, both mentally and morally? Right? So what about these cases where this doesn't track, right? Where people are drunk all the time, but they're also like super high achievers, and people who don't smoke or drink at all, but they're like, pieces of garbage, right? The answer is, he's got an answer, of course. First, that we do not know the height that those who drink and smoke would have attained had they not drunk or smoke, right? So sort of like an appeal to ignorance, right? It's like, well, even if you think that this guy is a super high achiever and he's smoking and drinking, it's not difficult to imagine a situation where this person does even better if they weren't smoking and drinking, right? So if you admit that that's possible, then you might be admitting that smoking and drinking is getting in the way. And secondly, from the fact that morally gifted people achieve great things in spite of the deteriorating effect of stupefying substances, we can but conclude that they would have produced yet greater things had they not stupefied themselves. Right, so again, if people seem to do great even if they're drinking and smoking, it's pretty easy to take the leap and say, well, imagine if they weren't, how much better things would be. And this is the fun part. It is very probable, as a friend remarked to me, that Kant's work would not have been written in such a curious and bad style had he not smoked so much. So Kant, Immanuel Kant, the great moral philosopher. Maybe we'll do Kant one day on this channel. I'm not so sure, but maybe it'll be tricky to pick something that's not just utterly obtuse, or, as Tolstoy would say, curious and bad writing, right? And he smoked a crazy amount, right? He smoked a lot of cigarettes, regularly and constantly. And Tolstoy is saying maybe that's why he was such a bad writer, right? So that's kind of funny, throwing shade at Kant. Lastly, the lower a man's mental and moral plane, the less does he feel the discord between his conscience and his life, and therefore the less does he feel a craving to stupefy himself. And on the other hand, a parallel reason explains why the most sensitive natures, those which immediately and morbidly feel the discord between life and conscience, so often indulge in narcotics and perish by them. So that's a pretty... I don't know why this is in a footnote. This should really be in the main text. But he's making a really powerful point here that, the people who are most apt to end up in addictive situations and dangerous situations with substances are the people who are most affected by their conscience, right? The people who really can't take the pain of not living up to some standard. The people who really are sensitive to their moral feelings about everything that's going on are much more at risk of turning to substance than people who just don't really give a shit. That's the claim. Again, not endorsing any of this. Not a psychologist, not a psychiatrist, right? Neither is Tolstoy, but this is just what he's saying based on his observations and beliefs, and he's a pretty smart guy. Okay, so that most of what goes on among us, whether done by people who rule and teach others, or by those who are ruled and taught, is done when the doers are not sober. Okay, so that's a pretty bold claim, right? Like everybody who runs the world is kind of drunk, at least a little bit, or under the influence of something. And let not this be taken as a joke or an exaggeration. The confusion, and above all, the imbecility of our lives arises chiefly from the constant state of intoxication in which most people live. Could people who are not drunk possibly do all the things being done around us, from building the Eiffel Tower to accepting military service, right? Look how messed up and crazy the world is. These people must be drunk. That's his argument, right? That's his idea, right? Without any need whatsoever, a company is formed, capital collected, men labor, make calculations, and draw plans. Millions of working days and thousands of tons of iron are spent to build a tower, and millions of people consider it their duty to climb up it, stop a while on it, and climb down again. and the building and visiting of this tower evoke no other reflection than a wish and intention to build other towers in other places, still bigger. Can sober people act like this? That's really funny. So, the Eiffel Tower. Why would anyone build that thing? Really dumb. Just a big tower. People go up and then come down. What's the frickin' point here? Why would anyone do that? They must be drunk. That's the argument. Okay, Leo. Guess he is not a fan of Paris. Or take another case. For dozens of years past, all the European peoples have been busy devising the very best ways of killing people and teaching as many young men as possible, as soon as they reach manhood, how to murder. Everyone knows that there can be no invasion by barbarians, but that these preparations made by the different civilized and Christian nations are directed against one another. Everyone knows that this is burdensome, painful, inconvenient, ruinous, immoral, impious, and irrational, but everyone continues to prepare for mutual murder. Right? Preparing for war. Utterly stupid. Right? Tolstoy was a hardcore pacifist, by the way, an activist, so this is totally in character for him to be saying. Right? Some devise political combinations to decide who is to kill whom and with what allies. Others direct those who are being taught to murder, and others again yield against their will, against their conscience, and against reason to these preparations for murder. Could sober people do these things? Only drunkards who never reach a state of sobriety could do them and live on in the horrible state of discord between life and conscience, in which not only in this, but in all other respects, the people of our society are now living. Never before, I suppose, have people lived with the demands of their conscience so evidently in contradiction to their actions. Okay, so now he's like being a crazy pacifist here, and he's saying that basically all the problems, all the political problems, all wars, and everything stupid on the planet is a result of people being drunk or under the influence of something. And if they were all sober, they clearly wouldn't be making these mistakes. So, I don't know. That's a crazy thought to chew on for a bit. I guess like it's because he has such a big faith in, or an unwavering faith in humankind and maybe his Christianity. He really thinks that like human nature is good, and that the only reason that things are really, really messed up is because we're somehow dulling our senses of right and wrong and good and bad, and that must be what's going on, because otherwise humanity wouldn't screw things up as bad as they are right now. And of course he's living in a sort of like newly post-industrial revolution era where, you know, the advent of capitalism and communism is just taking off, and you know, kids working in sweatshops and people moving into factories and things like that. So lots of massive changes going on in society at the time that he's writing. And I'm sure a lot of it seemed pretty strange, like building the Eiffel Tower. Why would anyone do that, according to him? Humanity today is, as it were, stuck fast. It is as though some external cause has hindered it from occupying a position in natural accord with its perceptions. And the cause, if not the only one, then certainly the greatest, is this physical condition of stupefaction induced by wine and tobacco to which the great majority of people in our society reduce themselves. Now, he's kind of like making an unfalsifiable assertion here, right? Because he's basically saying, like, well, it's just a fact that we know that getting really drunk can really impair your decision making, and that people smoke to avoid difficult situations, and that people, in fact, use any mind-altering substance to avoid difficult situations. And everybody who does that is, everybody who uses stupefying substances is doing that. And many, many, many people all up and down society use those substances. So, like, you know, it kind of follows that probably a lot of mistakes are being made in society up and down the ladder because people are kind of drunk and stoned all the time. And it's a fact that they are. So maybe we should fix that, I guess. Maybe. Maybe. Right. That's the challenge anyway, right? Emancipation from this terrible evil will be an epoch in the life of humanity. And that epoch appears to be at hand. The evil is recognized. See, I don't know what he's exactly talking about here. He says the evil is recognized. He seems to think that like that society is on the cusp of like mass prohibition. I don't know if he's like looking at the U.S. where like there was prohibition, at least of alcohol, around this time period, like 1890. I think that was like definitely Prohibition era. Prohibition wasn't repealed until what, 1914 or something like that, right? An alteration has already taken place in our perception concerning the use of stupefying substances. He could also be talking about developments in psychology as well, right? So maybe people started to realize that, oh yeah, being drunk all the time is not really good. It's not a good thing. So maybe, like, I don't know exactly what he's referring to in his context that supports the idea that, oh, we're about to outlaw all stupefying substances, or it's about to stop being a problem, and then the world will know enlightenment, right? People have understood the terrible harm of these things and are beginning to point them out. And this almost unnoticed alteration in perception will inevitably bring about the emancipation of men from the use of stupefying things, will enable them to open their eyes to the demands of their consciences, and they will begin to order their lives in accord with their perceptions. And this seems to be already beginning. But as always, it is beginning among the upper classes only after all the lower classes have already been infected. Yeah, I don't know what that is about, but yeah, that's it. That's Tolstoy on why men stupefy themselves. Pretty wild ride. It's a pretty fun read. A little longer, 16 pages. I mean, I'm sure we'll read stuff longer than that eventually, but yeah, pretty fun. I like that. It's just, I don't know if I agree with everything. I mean, it's definitely not scientific. He sort of makes up numbers sometimes, but at the same time, it seems pretty perceptive. And when you really like, it's easy to look at the premises of the argument and feel the strength of what's supposed to follow in terms of like, well, you know, drugs do this in large quantities. They also do it in small quantities as well. The same sort of things going on, even if just, you know, at a lower impact on the individual level, but then generalize that across society. And it's pretty scary that everybody's kind of drunken on drugs all the time. That's pretty terrifying. And people say, oh, well, you know, I just have a drink. I just have a gummy because it helps me get to sleep, or I just have a glass of wine with dinner or whatever, and that doesn't do anything bad. And, well, you know, scale that up to the rest of society, and maybe it's not so good. So yeah, I don't know. I think it's a fun read. I like it, and I hope you did too. Even if you don't agree with it, at least I hope you learned some things about old Leo Tolstoy and what he thinks about stuff, and maybe, you know, there's some quotable and interesting perceptions of the human condition in there. I think so, and you know, even if we don't agree with the whole picture that he presents, which I think, you know, there's lots to disagree with, but either way, fun read, and I hope you enjoyed. And that's it for this video, and I'll see you in the next one.